There is one detail about that evening that simply does not make sense. And once you notice it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Strangely enough, it has nothing to do with anything anyone actually said out loud. The king arrived at a family dinner carrying a sealed document. This was not a state function, not a formal council meeting, but a private memorial dinner for his own mother inside Windsor, attended only by family members and household staff. Charles entered that room holding a folder, placed it on the table beside his glass, and simply left it there. That is not normal. You do not bring official paperwork to your mother's memorial dinner. The whole purpose of a private family gathering is that it is supposed to be one of the rare places in royal life where documents and official business remain somewhere else. Yet Charles brought the folder anyway. More importantly, he placed it somewhere everyone could clearly see it. And when the argument erupted roughly an hour later, he did not intervene. He remained seated at the head of the table and kept looking toward that folder. That detail tells you something important. Charles entered that dining room already expecting trouble, and he apparently knew exactly what he intended to do when it happened. Subscribe before we continue, because that folder is only one part of what happened. The other part is why I believe this entire story has been presented in completely the wrong order. Before we go further, I'm Mark Holden, and this is Mark Holden Reports. I examine the records, official filings, and reporting surrounding this family, then explain what I believe is actually happening behind the scenes rather than simply repeating what the press office wants everyone to hear. Stay with me, because there was another copy of that document, and where that second copy came from completely changes who should really be considered the hero of this story. Start with the dinner itself, because the exact sequence of events matters, and much of the coverage has compressed everything together. It was a memorial dinner at Windsor attended by senior members of the family along with a small number of household staff. It was a private gathering intended to remember the late Queen, the kind of family occasion that happens every year and normally receives almost no attention because nothing unusual ever happens. But this time was different. Sophie had been chosen to deliver the tribute. And that decision is where everything really begins. The Duchess of Edinburgh, wife of the King's youngest brother, had been asked to stand before the family and speak about Elizabeth, and had approved the choice. That detail was not in dispute. Before everyone entered the room, and noticed Sophie gripping the pages of her tribute tightly. It was the kind of nervous grip someone develops after reading the same words dozens of times, while still wondering whether they will be able to say them aloud without becoming emotional. And approached her and gave her one simple reassurance. You were chosen because you understood her heart. Sophie eventually stood and began reading. She spoke about loyalty, kindness, and a lifetime of duty carried out without expecting anything in return. In many ways, those qualities summed up the entire argument for the late Queen, and everyone sitting around that table understood exactly what Sophie meant. She had barely made it into the tribute when Camilla suddenly interrupted her. People interrupt one another at dinner tables all the time. Usually, it means absolutely nothing. But this was different. Everyone in that room understood within seconds that this was not an ordinary interruption. Because of what Camilla said next. She accused Sophie of turning a private family remembrance into a performance centered around herself. Think about that accusation for a moment. They were sitting inside the late Queen's own home, gathered to remember a woman who had died, and one member of the family was accusing another of using her grief for personal attention. That accusation carried far more history inside that family than it might appear to on the surface. For decades, the royals had faced arguments about which members were genuinely grieving and which were supposedly performing their emotions for the public. Those arguments had never completely disappeared. Nearly everyone around that table had, at some point, experienced accusations about whether their emotions were sincere. And Camilla had just chosen one of the most sensitive accusations she could possibly make. Sophie tried to continue. That is the detail that stands out. She did not sit back down. She did not argue. Her hands were visibly trembling, but she forced herself through another sentence because she had been given a responsibility and intended to complete it. Then Camilla interrupted her again. And the second interruption was even harsher than the first. She asked Sophie whether she had ever truly understood the burden of the crown. Consider exactly what that question implied. Sophie was not the wife of a sovereign, and she never would be. She had married the younger son and spent decades carrying out quieter, less glamorous royal duties away from the center of attention. She had never demanded to stand at the heart of the monarchy. Yet in front of her own husband and the rest of the family, Camilla's question effectively suggested that Sophie was not senior enough to understand the grief or responsibility surrounding that table. That was the moment Sophie could no longer hold herself together. She lowered the pages. Her hand moved over her mouth. And in front of the entire table, Sophie began to cry. There is one detail about that evening that simply does not make sense. And once you notice it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Strangely enough, it has nothing to do with anything anyone actually said out loud. The king arrived at a family dinner carrying a sealed document. This was not a state function, not a formal council meeting, but a private memorial dinner for his own mother inside Windsor, attended only by family members and household staff. Charles entered that room holding a folder, placed it on the table beside his glass, and simply left it there. That is not normal. You do not bring official paperwork to your mother's memorial dinner. The whole purpose of a private family gathering is that it is supposed to be one of the rare places in royal life where documents and official business remain somewhere else. Yet Charles brought the folder anyway. More importantly, he placed it somewhere everyone could clearly see it. And when the argument erupted roughly an hour later, he did not intervene. He remained seated at the head of the table and kept looking toward that folder. That detail tells you something important. Charles entered that dining room already expecting trouble, and he apparently knew exactly what he intended to do when it happened. Subscribe before we continue, because that folder is only one part of what happened. The other part is why I believe this entire story has been presented in completely the wrong order. Before we go further, I'm Mark Holden, and this is Mark Holden Reports. I examine the records, official filings, and reporting surrounding this family, then explain what I believe is actually happening behind the scenes rather than simply repeating what the press office wants everyone to hear. Stay with me, because there was another copy of that document, and where that second copy came from completely changes who should really be considered the hero of this story. Start with the dinner itself, because the exact sequence of events matters, and much of the coverage has compressed everything together. It was a memorial dinner at Windsor attended by senior members of the family along with a small number of household staff. It was a private gathering intended to remember the late Queen, the kind of family occasion that happens every year and normally receives almost no attention because nothing unusual ever happens. But this time was different. Sophie had been chosen to deliver the tribute. And that decision is where everything really begins. The Duchess of Edinburgh, wife of the King's youngest brother, had been asked to stand before the family and speak about Elizabeth, and had approved the choice. That detail was not in dispute. Before everyone entered the room, and noticed Sophie gripping the pages of her tribute tightly. It was the kind of nervous grip someone develops after reading the same words dozens of times, while still wondering whether they will be able to say them aloud without becoming emotional. And approached her and gave her one simple reassurance. You were chosen because you understood her heart. Sophie eventually stood and began reading. She spoke about loyalty, kindness, and a lifetime of duty carried out without expecting anything in return. In many ways, those qualities summed up the entire argument for the late Queen, and everyone sitting around that table understood exactly what Sophie meant. She had barely made it into the tribute when Camilla suddenly interrupted her. People interrupt one another at dinner tables all the time. Usually, it means absolutely nothing. But this was different. Everyone in that room understood within seconds that this was not an ordinary interruption. Because of what Camilla said next. She accused Sophie of turning a private family remembrance into a performance centered around herself. Think about that accusation for a moment. They were sitting inside the late Queen's own home, gathered to remember a woman who had died, and one member of the family was accusing another of using her grief for personal attention. That accusation carried far more history inside that family than it might appear to on the surface. For decades, the royals had faced arguments about which members were genuinely grieving and which were supposedly performing their emotions for the public. Those arguments had never completely disappeared. Nearly everyone around that table had, at some point, experienced accusations about whether their emotions were sincere. And Camilla had just chosen one of the most sensitive accusations she could possibly make. Sophie tried to continue. That is the detail that stands out. She did not sit back down. She did not argue. Her hands were visibly trembling, but she forced herself through another sentence because she had been given a responsibility and intended to complete it. Then Camilla interrupted her again. And the second interruption was even harsher than the first. She asked Sophie whether she had ever truly understood the burden of the crown. Consider exactly what that question implied. Sophie was not the wife of a sovereign, and she never would be. She had married the younger son and spent decades carrying out quieter, less glamorous royal duties away from the center of attention. She had never demanded to stand at the heart of the monarchy. Yet in front of her own husband and the rest of the family, Camilla's question effectively suggested that Sophie was not senior enough to understand the grief or responsibility surrounding that table. That was the moment Sophie could no longer hold herself together. She lowered the pages. Her hand moved over her mouth. And in front of the entire table, Sophie began to cry. Inside, the program was something reproduced in the late Queen's own handwriting. It was a short personal message. Elizabeth had written it following one of the most painful periods the family had experienced, and the message had been addressed directly to Sophie. She thanked Sophie for her consistency and kindness during a time when grief had left almost everyone around her emotionally exhausted. But the message contained more than simple gratitude. Elizabeth had also expressed a wish that Sophie should lead a future private remembrance. That single detail completely changed the meaning of Sophie's role that evening. This was no longer simply a speaking position assigned by someone working inside the palace. It was a written request from the late monarch herself, personally naming Sophie. And once that existed in writing, it was extremely difficult to simply hand the responsibility to somebody else. There was nobody above Elizabeth's written wish to appeal to. Camilla read the message twice. And whatever she felt during those few moments, the page represented something deeply personal. It was evidence of a particular kind of affection and trust between Elizabeth and Sophie. After 2 decades of marriage to Elizabeth's son, Camilla apparently had no comparable handwritten message of her own. Now she was standing inside the chapel holding one that had been written to somebody else. Camilla argued that reproducing such a personal message inside the memorial program could make Sophie's tribute appear calculated. In her view, displaying something so intimate might create the impression that the tribute had been arranged to strengthen Sophie's position within the family. And to be fair, that concern was not completely unreasonable. There is an argument that Camilla had a point. When private affection from a monarch is printed inside a program and distributed around a royal gathering, it can begin to look less like a personal memory and more like proof of status. Anyone who has followed royal life for long enough knows how easily a photograph, letter, or private moment involving the right person can become a symbol of influence. And Camilla understood better than most what happens when the institution decides someone is being elevated for the wrong reasons. She had lived with that kind of judgment for decades. So the concern itself could be debated. The way Camilla expressed it could not. And when she raised the same issue again hours later at the dinner table, she pushed it so far that even her own husband appeared unwilling to engage with her. Sophie never raised her voice during the earlier disagreement. Her position was straightforward. Removing Elizabeth's message from the program would mean disregarding the recorded wish of someone who was no longer alive to explain or defend it. That was Sophie's argument. And she remained consistent throughout the entire evening. But for Camilla, the disagreement had become about much more than a memorial program. It touched something she had spent much of her adult life dealing with, whose feelings inside that family were treated as legitimate. Throughout the 1990s, Camilla had watched the institution and the public decide whose version of grief, marriage, and emotional suffering carried greater weight. For decades, she had occupied the position of the other woman, both technically and symbolically. And now she was one of the most senior members of the same institution that had once judged her so harshly. That afternoon, inside the chapel, she was holding a handwritten message from the late Queen that seemed to repeat an old pattern. Elizabeth had selected someone. She had named that person personally. She had put the decision into writing. And once again, that person was not Camilla. And entered as Camilla placed the program back onto the table. Then Camilla said something that made the confrontation later that evening almost unavoidable. She argued that no member of the family should use personal affection as a way of increasing their prominence within the monarchy. Sophie's expression changed. But she did not argue with Camilla. Instead, she turned toward the household secretary and asked a single question. Did the wording printed in the program match the officially approved version? The official confirmed that it did, and immediately gave an instruction. Not a single word was to be removed. Pay attention to what happened next, because this was the moment the disagreement effectively became settled, even though Camilla clearly did not see it that way. Camilla said the issue was not finished. Then she began walking toward the door, and responded that their mother had already made the decision. That exchange matters because what followed was not simply an emotional reaction later at dinner. Something happened during the hours between this chapel disagreement and the family taking their seats that evening, and obtained another copy of the sealed instruction. And before everyone assembled for dinner, she placed that copy inside Charles's folder without telling Camilla. That was not the behavior of someone simply responding to an unexpected argument at dinner, and had been told the issue was not finished, understood exactly what that warning meant, and used the hours before dinner to make sure that if the confrontation returned, the evidence would already be sitting inside the room. And Charles was not simply an innocent observer either. He had read the instruction earlier that morning. He examined it, closed the folder without making any comment, and then ordered that the folder be kept beside him during dinner in case his authority was questioned. Think carefully about what that means. Before a private family dinner had even begun, Charles deliberately arranged for that document to remain within reach in case someone challenged who had the authority to make the final decision. And there was really only one person sitting at that table who was likely to raise that challenge. This is where I think the events at Windsor need to be understood differently. The dinner was not simply destroyed because one person suddenly lost control of her emotions. Instead, two of the most senior members of the family had already concluded hours earlier that a confrontation was likely, and both had quietly prepared for it, and made sure the paperwork was there. Charles made sure it remained beside him. Then both of them sat down at that table knowing exactly what the folder contained. And eventually, the situation unfolded almost exactly as they had anticipated. Camilla made the challenge they had prepared for. She did it in front of witnesses. An official record was being kept. And by the end of the evening, her position regarding the memorial had been reduced through a written decision authorized by her own husband. I want to be precise here. I am not suggesting Anne and Charles wanted the confrontation to happen. I do not believe they did. Nobody would deliberately want a memorial dinner for their mother to collapse into that kind of scene. But they apparently recognized that trouble was possible. And instead of preventing the confrontation, they prepared themselves to deal with it if it happened. That leads to the uncomfortable question at the center of this entire story. If Anne knew there might be a confrontation, and Charles knew the same thing, why did neither of them warn Sophie? She entered that dining room carrying her tribute, believing she was simply going to speak about a woman she had loved. Meanwhile, two people who had known Sophie for decades had apparently already considered the possibility that she could be challenged while delivering it, and had squeezed Sophie's arm beforehand and reminded her that she had been selected because she understood the late Queen's heart. That was supportive. It was also true. But it does not sound like something said by a person who was completely confident the evening would pass without difficulty. That is the detail worth considering. I do not believe Anne intended to put Sophie in harm's way. But there was an obvious alternative. Someone could have taken Sophie aside for a minute and quietly warned her. Tonight may become difficult. Stay firm. You will not be standing alone. Nobody did that. And there was probably a reason. Warning Sophie would have required someone to acknowledge, before anything had happened, that they expected the Queen to behave badly during a memorial for the late monarch. Nobody inside that household wanted to say something like that openly in advance. So instead, they allowed events to unfold. Then they dealt with the consequences afterward. And once the dinner had ended, they dealt with those consequences decisively, and cleared the room until only the private secretary responsible for the official record remained. No household staff.
No ads.
Nobody who would spend the rest of the evening repeating fragments of the argument through palace corridors. Just one official with a notebook, and wanted what happened next documented. But she did not want it turned into a spectacle. Then she removed the instruction from Charles's folder and placed it directly on the table between herself and Camilla, according to the account being recorded, and read the instruction slowly. That was a deliberate and extremely forceful decision. Reading the handwritten wishes of a dead woman aloud in front of someone who had just reduced another family member to tears was no longer simply part of an argument. It was evidence being presented. The instruction contained two important points. First, Sophie was to deliver the family remembrance completely. Second, the monarch's eldest daughter had been entrusted with protecting the integrity of the occasion. That second provision ended the dispute. It was not an honorary title. It was not ceremonial language. It gave Anne responsibility for preserving the character of the memorial. So when Anne stood and stopped the dinner, she was not simply imposing her own authority. She was carrying out the responsibility her mother had specifically placed in writing. Camilla reached toward the document and placed her hand over the page. That was when Charles finally spoke. For the first time since the confrontation began, he directly entered the discussion. And he said only one thing. He confirmed that earlier that morning he had personally authenticated his mother's handwriting. At that point, the argument was effectively over. Once the king had stated in front of witnesses, with a secretary recording the exchange, that he had personally verified the handwriting, there was nowhere left for the dispute to go. Camilla removed her hand from the document. And consider her position at that exact moment. She had entered the dinner as one of the most senior people in the country. Within a relatively short period of time, she had been overruled by her sister-in-law. Her husband had remained silent when she directly appealed to him. And then that same husband had confirmed the document that supported Anne's position. All of it happened in front of an official secretary who was writing down what occurred. And every person involved was a member of her own family. This was not happening at a state ceremony or in front of television cameras. It happened during a private family meal inside a residence where Camilla herself had rooms. And the entire situation had developed from only a few sentences spoken over a memorial tribute that, under ordinary circumstances, nobody outside those walls would ever have known about. This was the point where I had to go back and examine the sequence again, because the version being repeated publicly did not completely match what had happened, and had not simply lost her temper at the dinner table. She had arranged for the necessary paperwork to be in place several hours before the confrontation even occurred. And what Charles did afterwards suggests that he had already understood the seriousness of the situation as well. Following the dinner, Charles went into his study. That was where the consequences of the evening were ultimately decided, and joined him. But she did not immediately demand that Camilla be punished, even though after what had happened, she could easily have argued for consequences. Instead, and raised one central question. Before getting to that, consider the history surrounding those two people. Charles and Anne had faced another period decades earlier when the royal family's handling of personal grief had gone disastrously wrong. The consequences of that period followed the institution for years. Charles had been directly at the center of it. And, meanwhile, had largely protected her reputation by refusing to publicly involve herself in the emotional battles surrounding the family. But on this evening, she was prepared to challenge something directly. The question was simple. Should rank ever excuse cruelty simply because that cruelty is presented as an exercise of authority? That was the real issue. Camilla's defense, as far as one existed, was that she believed she was protecting the dignity of the memorial from someone potentially using the occasion to improve their personal standing. As a senior member of the family, she had every right to raise concerns about the character of an official or private royal occasion. But the problem was how she chose to express those concerns. She had reduced a woman in her 60s to tears during a memorial gathering for her mother-in-law. Charles read the official event record twice. According to those familiar with what happened, one particular sentence caught his attention. It describes Sophie lowering the pages of a tribute when she could no longer control her emotions. Charles removed his glasses. He placed them down. And for a while, he said nothing. Then he signed a private directive. This was a written instruction from the sovereign intended for a limited group of people rather than for public release. And the directive contained 4 decisions. First, the memorial dinner would remain cancelled. There would be no quiet attempt to organize the same dinner again a few days later and behave as though the confrontation had never occurred. Second, Camilla would no longer participate in the remaining planning decisions concerning the memorial program. Third, Sophie would be allowed to deliver her tribute in full at another gathering. Nothing would be removed. Nothing would be added merely to hide the reason the first attempt had failed. And then came the 4th decision. This one revealed most clearly how Charles viewed what had happened. Camilla would apologize directly to Sophie. There would be no aides sitting in the room. There would be no carefully prepared statement. No communications official would write the apology for her. Charles specifically prevented the palace from reducing the incident to the usual language about an unfortunate misunderstanding during an emotional period for the family. Anyone who has followed the monarchy for a long time understands how unusual that was. Institutions like this are extremely skilled at producing carefully neutral statements that allow everyone involved to move forward without publicly accepting responsibility. Charles refused to allow that approach. Camilla received the directive. She read it. Then she folded the document once and asked her staff to leave the room. And this is where the real cost of the evening becomes clearer. Much of the discussion around what happened treated the consequences as little more than a public embarrassment. But for Camilla, it represented something much deeper. She had spent decades building her place within that family. Every part of her position had been achieved despite enormous resistance. When she married Charles in 2005, a significant part of the public remained deeply hostile toward her. 4 years afterward, she carried out royal engagements while gradually building acceptance. Eventually, she stood inside Westminster Abbey and was crowned beside Charles. There had been a time when such a moment would have seemed almost impossible. Yet during one memorial evening for the woman whose acceptance had taken so long to achieve, Camilla lost something that could not easily be replaced by another royal duty or another ceremonial appearance. She lost her role in the family's private remembrance of their own mother. That is what the directive really changed. It was not simply removing an appointment from a calendar. It altered Camilla's place within that particular expression of family grief. Now compare two things. It reportedly took Charles less than an hour to decide on the directive and only a signature to put it into effect. 4 clear provisions. All written down. All capable of being enforced. Yet earlier that same day, a disagreement that might have been resolved through a short and honest conversation had instead developed into a major family confrontation. That tells you something important about the institution. It is remarkably effective at creating consequences once something has gone wrong. But it can be remarkably poor at having the conversations that might prevent the damage in the first place. The monarchy could produce a signed instruction within an hour that permanently changed someone's involvement. Yet it could not produce a few honest sentences across a table before the situation collapsed. Almost everything that happened at Windsor that evening can be traced back to the fact that during the hours before dinner, nobody was prepared to openly say what everyone apparently already understood. By midnight, the dining room had been cleared. The place settings were removed. The final course was never served. And what happened to Sophie's unfinished tribute and the memorial program showed how seriously the household regarded the incident. Neither document was thrown away. Both were placed into secure storage alongside the official record of what had happened. Meanwhile, Sophie sat in a smaller drawing room. The tribute she had been unable to finish rested across her knees, and was there with her. And according to those familiar with the situation, and was furious. But her anger was not only directed toward Camilla. She was angry with herself, and had known there was tension before the dinner. She had made sure the documents were ready because of it. But right up until the confrontation actually happened, she had apparently believed Camilla would never go that far during a memorial for the late Queen. She had been wrong. And Sophie, the woman and herself had encouraged to stand before that table, had ended up paying the emotional price for that misjudgment. Later that night, Sophie said something to Edward that stayed with me. She worried that her closeness to the late Queen had somehow been transformed into a weapon in somebody else's dispute. Think about what that meant for her. For years, Sophie had quietly supported an elderly woman who had become increasingly lonely after losing her husband. Now, because of what had been said at dinner, Sophie was being forced to wonder whether people might look back at that relationship and interpret genuine affection as some kind of strategy. Edward told her exactly the opposite. He believed that refusing to remove Elizabeth's words from the tribute had respected their relationship rather than exploited it. And Camilla did something that same night, before anyone instructed her to, that deserves to be mentioned. She removed her own name from the schedule for the following morning's memorial service. She crossed it out herself and returned the schedule without adding any explanation. She clearly understood the seriousness of what had happened. Nobody needed to come into the room and explain it to her. Early the following morning, and asked Sophie to meet privately. The two women sat together in a small room at Windsor. There were 2 cups of tea in front of them, but neither woman touched them, and had reportedly remained awake for most of the night and requested the meeting herself in the early hours. This time there were no aides, no folders, and nobody sitting nearby recording every sentence, and asked Sophie one question. Did she want the tribute cancelled permanently? It was a genuine offer, and made it clear that Sophie was under no obligation to stand up and attempt the speech again. If she wanted to walk away from the entire memorial tribute, nobody in the family would consider it a failure. She had already endured far more than anyone should have been expected to endure simply to honor someone she cared about. And Anne's willingness to give her that choice matters. and had every institutional reason to want the tribute completed. Her mother had left the instruction, and had been given responsibility for protecting the memorial. Only hours earlier, she had ended an entire dinner over that responsibility. If Sophie now refused to deliver the tribute, Anne's actions could easily have looked excessive to people who did not understand what had happened. Yet Anne still offered Sophie the opportunity to walk away. Sophie placed the pages on the table between them. Then she pointed toward the final section. It was the part she had never reached the previous evening because Camilla had interrupted her before she could finish. The passage describes service as having the strength to remain gentle even when others interpret gentleness as weakness. After everything Sophie had experienced only hours earlier, those words carried an entirely different weight. She told and she wanted to finish the tribute. And she explained why. If she walked away now, the final memory associated with the speech would always be the moment she had been forced to stop. Sophie did not believe that should become the lasting memory of a tribute written for the late Queen. So another gathering was arranged. Not another formal dinner. Instead, it would be smaller. Family only.
No elaborate banquet.
No formal program. And importantly, no seating arranged according to rank. And would stand beside Sophie. Sophie would deliver the tribute herself. But before that happened, she set one condition. She wanted to meet Camilla privately. And she was prepared to listen to an apology only if Camilla spoke in her own words. Nothing prepared by a secretary. Nothing negotiated beforehand. Nothing carefully constructed by palace communication staff. After being humiliated in front of the family, Sophie was now deciding the terms on which she would accept an apology. And her main requirement was simple. It had to be genuine. Sophie also requested that the smaller memorial gathering have no seating based on precedence. That decision mattered more than it might initially appear. Royal seating arrangements are one of the clearest visible expressions of hierarchy. And hierarchy was exactly what had been at the center of the confrontation the night before. Sophie could have used the new gathering to emphasize her own importance. She did not. She was not interested in defeating Camilla. She simply wanted to complete the tribute. By midday, details of the cancelled dinner had begun circulating outside Windsor. It did not necessarily require one dramatic palace leak. There had been numerous people around the dinner and elsewhere inside the building. When a royal dinner unexpectedly ends early, it creates dozens of small clues. Cars leave sooner than expected. Food remains unserved. Schedules suddenly change. Staff begin receiving revised instructions. Journalists who spend their careers covering the royal household know how to assemble those details. Soon the story was being reconstructed publicly, and became the focus of much of that coverage. That was probably the last thing she wanted. For decades, she had built her working reputation around completing duties without becoming the center of attention. Yet one decision at a dinner table had suddenly placed her directly inside the story. Photographs showed Anne leaving Windsor looking serious. Sophie was seen leaving separately with visibly red eyes. And the public did not interpret what had happened as a complicated disagreement about royal protocol. The simpler interpretation was much more powerful. One woman had been pushed beyond what she could emotionally handle. Another woman had stepped in and stopped it. Broadcasters were able to establish several basic facts. The dinner had ended early. The memorial schedule had been changed. And the palace acknowledged Anne's formal responsibility regarding the remembrance. That last detail answered the question many people were asking. What authority did Anne actually have to stop the dinner? The answer was that the late Queen had placed that responsibility in writing. Charles personally approved the palace's statement. It confirmed that Sophie's tribute would still be delivered privately and acknowledged the confidence the late Queen had placed in her. The statement did not repeat Camilla's words. But importantly, it did not pretend that nothing damaging had happened either. Charles also gave his communications team a specific instruction. They were not to explain the cancelled dinner by blaming illness. They were not to call it a scheduling problem. And they were not to hide behind a security explanation. Any of those excuses could probably have ended public questions. But doing so would also have required minimizing what had happened to Sophie simply to protect the family's image. Charles refused to allow that. Outside the gates, people began leaving white roses. It was not a massive, organized demonstration. There were only small numbers at first. But one message attached to the flowers began receiving attention. Kindness is not weakness. Those words reflected the part of Sophie's tribute she had never managed to reach during the dinner. Someone following the story had taken that message and placed it outside the gates. Soon it was being repeated more widely. Britain has seen flowers placed outside royal gates before, and those images carry enormous historical weight. Decades earlier, flowers had represented public anger toward a family that many believed had failed to understand the emotions surrounding Diana. This time, the message was different. People were responding to a situation in which one member of the family had been treated badly, while another had immediately stepped in to stop it. And many appeared to approve of Anne's response. But there is another side to this story. The second copy of the instruction changes how the entire confrontation should be understood. Because the people being praised for responding to the incident had actually prepared for the possibility of trouble before anyone sat down to dinner. They protected the occasion. But they did not fully protect Sophie. And Charles apparently understood hours earlier that Camilla might challenge her. Their preparations focused on the document, the official record, and the authority needed to stop the confrontation if it went too far. But none of those preparations directly protected the woman who would be standing there holding the tribute. The instruction was protected. The program was protected. The integrity of the memorial was protected. Exactly as Elizabeth had requested. But Sophie entered that dining room without knowing what might happen. I do not think that was deliberate cruelty. In some ways, it reveals something deeper about the institution itself. For centuries, the monarchy has learned how to protect structure, procedure, and continuity. Sometimes it becomes so focused on protecting the arrangement that it fails to protect the individual standing inside it. Even people with good intentions can fall into that instinct without realizing it. Before the smaller gathering took place, the private apology happened. Camilla acknowledged that jealousy and insecurity had allowed her to treat the memorial as though it were a competition. She also accepted that her rank did not give her ownership over the family's grief. Sophie listened. And then she responded in a way I did not expect. She accepted the apology without pretending that a few carefully chosen words could immediately repair everything. She told Camilla that forgiveness would depend on changed behavior, not simply on a well-delivered apology. Then Sophie went to finish the tribute. It happened that same afternoon. Same building. Same family. But the atmosphere was completely different. Camilla was not present, and stood beside Sophie. She did not introduce her. She did not explain what had happened. And she did not attempt to claim any credit for her role in the previous evening. She simply stood there. Sophie returned to the section where she had lost her voice the night before. Then she continued. She read the entire tribute, including the words about remaining gentle when other people mistake gentleness for weakness. This time nobody interrupted her. And when Sophie finished, the silence in the room finally belonged to the woman everyone had originally gathered to remember. That had been the entire purpose from the beginning. Camilla remained absent. She withdrew from memorial planning for the remainder of the season, and Charles accepted that decision rather than formally forcing her out. That distinction matters. Nothing about Camilla's official position changed. She remained queen. She continued attending state occasions and carrying out her responsibilities. But something smaller had changed. And that change was permanent. There was now a written record inside the royal household documenting that a memorial dinner had been stopped because of her conduct. The king had approved that record. And long after everyone involved is gone, that document could remain. Years from now, someone examining those archives may encounter Camilla through what was written about that dining room. That is the strange power of official records. Arguments disappear. Memories change. But documents remain. And the royal family already understands how powerful that can be. For years, it has lived with the consequences of the written records surrounding Diana and the events of the 1990s. Camilla witnessed much of that history herself. She understood better than most that once something enters the official record, it can outlive everyone involved. Many people will remember this story primarily as the evening and protected Sophie. And she did. When the moment came, but there is another lesson worth considering. Camilla had spent decades knowing exactly what it felt like to be treated as though she did not belong. She knew what it was like to enter a room and sense that everyone inside believed she was an outsider. That experience could have made her the person at that dinner who understood Sophie's position better than anyone. Instead, She looked at a woman holding the handwritten words of someone she had genuinely cared about. A woman who had never seriously competed with her for status. A woman who had quietly supported Elizabeth during some of the loneliest months of her life. And Camilla responded by questioning whether Sophie had enough rank to understand the burden surrounding that grief. At that moment, she was not really protecting the memorial. She was protecting her position within it. And perhaps that is the most revealing part of the entire evening. After spending so many years feeling like an outsider herself, once Camilla finally stood securely inside the institution, she used that position to make somebody else feel as though they did not belong. And all of it happened while the two people capable of stopping the confrontation already had the document needed to do exactly that.